What percentage of your practice deals with victims of sexual abuse by clergy?
I would say victims of sexual abuse in general is about 90% of my practice, and about half of that is clergy.
That sounds like a lot.
It is a lot. I mean, one is too many, but there are American attorneys that I've dealt with who have done this as exclusively clergy abuse as a career for over a decade now. So
that is a stunning thought, that a lawyer can make his career out of sexual abuse by clergy.
Right, and it's a real strong indication that this is more than the odd case. This is some sort of systemic, large-scale problem that lawyers can have decades of dealing with this specific type of litigation.
Put the case of Father Sylvester in context for me. How big is it in scope and in size?
It's the largest we've seen here out of this office. I think the largest we've seen in Canada with respect to a single perpetrator and number of known victims. So it's large. I think it simply, though, is a case where more of the victims have been identified than in other cases. I mean, the fact that he had 50-some victims over a career as a pedophile priest, I don't find as unusual, because we have other cases where we've identified dozens of victims. The issue is, do you ever find them all? How long is this person left in the field operating?
But when you extrapolate, I mean, this is a man who has had a career that started in the early 50s.
Right.
So when there are 47 victims in a criminal case, how many would you suspect there are actually?
Over 100. I would be confident in saying there'd be over 100 victims.
And you base that on what?
I base that on our experience that we usually only get to identify the tip of the iceberg, about a third of the known victims. And I take that from cases where priests have said, I have 25 victims, and we can only identify a third of them by name. And they're of no assistance in identifying the others. And I honestly think they have so many victims at times they forget.
Could you give me a sense of these women, a profile?
These women have struggled with this issue, and it's really interrupted their lives. And a lot of them have tried to help others as a result of what they've gone through. I find many of these women have went into professions or attempted to go into professions where they help others. There are some women that I've interviewed that still have grave difficulty even speaking about the abuse, and a handful of our clients are almost to the point of being dysfunctional as a result of having gone through the criminal process and the stress that created.
They were little girls. This abuse happened in some cases 30 years ago, and it's still such a large part of their lives.
It's hard for people to really wrap their head around the impact of childhood sexual abuse. When you get into it, you start to work with the victims, or you get into the literature, you realize that this is a devastating event on a young person's life. I mean, it is when you're being formed as a human being, you have this traumatic event or series of traumatic events. It has lasting impact on a person's life. There is no question. Defense experts, both sides of this issue, agree that it is a significant interrupter in a person's development.
How typical is the London diocese? Because it has had an extraordinary amount of convictions of priests for aberrant sexual behavior.
I don't know if I'd call it an anomaly here in London, and I would base this on the fact that a lot of my cases, due to geography, involve the Diocese of London. We do have cases with other dioceses in Ontario, and I can tell you that this pattern of the silent shuffle and this institutional foot dragging in the litigation seems to be common across the board.
But what about sheer numbers?
Sheer numbers, it is interesting that London's had so many. I think London has probably had more exposure through the media, through litigation, through some of the criminal process.
There have already been 12 convictions of priests here.
Let's put it this way. I'm not surprised with that number of convictions here in this diocese, and I would think that if other dioceses were really put under the microscope, we'd start to see some similar numbers.
Bishop Fabro and many, even critics of the church, have applauded his caring statement, the fact that he apologized to the victims of Father Sylvester. He admitted that the church as an institution failed to protect those victims. How far does that go to setting things right?
I'd like to see that same proactive approach or mandate directed to his litigation counsel in these matters.
What do you mean?
So that we could get some movement on these cases and we could get some resolution for some of the victims that need that now.
He's talking nice and the lawyers are dragging their feet?
I think there's some truth to that. I mean, I appreciate that litigation takes time, but I really think in the circumstances, these Sylvester cases should be further along than they are. Our firm proposed some sort of alternative dispute resolution mechanism quite a few months ago, and it really hasn't gone anywhere. I don't want to get too much into the litigation and the negotiations surrounding that, but let's just say that the public face of the diocese on this matter doesn't exactly match up with the litigation phase.
There is much talk about change, that it shined a light on the church and the way they were doing things, and maybe they were remiss. There's much talk about a new dawn. You're not buying this, clearly.
I've done this probably too long to really buy into that right away. I think actions need to speak louder than words. We've said before, apologies and homilies are great, but it's fleeting, and it's not enough of a demonstration of a real intention to change.
And there have been many apologies and homilies in the past.
I think the best example of the institutional foot dragging in making change here is we went as a law firm on behalf of a number of victims to the Canadian Catholic Conference of Bishops when they met in Cornwall this year and gave them 3 concrete, easy to implement proposals, and their response was, "We can't organize as bishops. Sorry." They are
organized as bishops. They're the Conference of Bishops.
They're organized to fight same-sex marriage. They're organized to weigh in on the abortion debate when it raises its head. But their defense to our suggestions was that they can't organize on this issue of sexual abuse by their own clergy.
What did you suggest?
We suggested that there would be automatic defrocking application upon criminal conviction for sex abuse.
It didn't make sense to them?
Didn't make sense to them.
But on what grounds? I'm curious. What did they say?
Well, their position is they can't force individual bishops to enforce these policies because each bishop is king in his own diocese. So they didn't even really approach the merit of our suggestions.
But it's not about bishops and authority. It's priests having sex with parishioners.
That's right. I mean, it seems very common sense to me. I think if you went to a daycare and asked them to automatically terminate anyone who was employed there and was convicted of sexual crimes with children, that would be a no-brainer. But there seems to be a resistance within the institutional church to do this. Their suggestion is that they need to be compassionate, deal with cases on a case-by-case basis, and that ultimately the defrocking decision is left up to the Vatican. We simply ask they make the application, and we can't even get that far.
What are the other 2 recommendations you brought before the conference?
We wanted a publicly posted list of priests that are still practicing or serving the church in some capacity that have been convicted. And we'd ask that be done by diocese.
There are convicted sexual predators still giving sacrament in the church?
Well, there are priests out there who have had serious allegations against them, or that have been investigated, or even in some cases that have been convicted, who still practice or perform some service for the church. Let me use the example of Father Barry Glendenning, who is a notorious offender from this area, who we went to the civil trial with. When we tracked him down at the early stages of the litigation, he was a lecturer at St. Paul's Seminary in Ottawa. Having been convicted in the 1970s, and having been chased around this country with allegations, the church kept him in service until his normal and full career was completed. So The other problem is we don't know who is where. I mean, it's very difficult to track priests. It's very difficult to determine where a priest was and where he is now. The advantage the church has is it can cross international, cultural, and linguistic borders easily.
So there are priests on the lam now?
Well, there's priests that have fled the U.S., as you know, that are public knowledge in response to criminal investigations or civil cases.
In Canada? Here?
We have a priest in Canada, or we have a priest that was in Canada that was accused of impregnating one of his parishioners, a woman that he was counseling with regards to marriage counseling. And he's now in the U.S. So this movement of priests across borders and the silent shuffle, I would like to make clear, continues to this day.
And the third recommendation?
The third recommendation was some sort of uniform policy with respect to counseling. Now, to the kudos of some dioceses in Ontario, and London Diocese is one of them, they now provide without prejudice counseling as soon as you bring forward the claim or the complainant. So that means they will pay for the psychological counseling in the short term until the litigation is concluded. Some dioceses do that easily. Some dioceses in Ontario make it very difficult. So we wanted a uniform policy, sort of a guaranteed wait time.
Have there been any priests that you know of that have been handed over by the church, voluntarily handed over to police, or has it all been through the initiative of the victims?
I don't know of a single priest in my experience that has been voluntarily handed over to the police.
No one?
Not one.
None of the ones that have been convicted in the London Diocese?
Not a one that I'm aware of.
I'm thinking about Sylvester. Is the crime one priest doing terrible things? Or is it bigger than that?
It's much bigger than that, because if it was about one priest doing horrible things, unsupported by others, he would have been taken to the police in 1954 when he was first reported to the pastor of Sacred Heart Parish in Windsor. But the fact that there was an institutional support, inadvertent support, I'm not saying they directly said keep up what you're doing, but there's an institutional veil of secrecy and an inability to deal with these issues at the church level. There's the issue of the bishops making political decisions rather than moral decisions by deciding to avoid scandal and move this man on to another parish. So there's many issues here which are at the heart of all clergy sex abuse cases. And Sylvester is a perfect case for those issues to really surface and be heard in a trial, and for the public to become exposed to just the depth of the problem. This is only one example of something that I see as a systemic institutional fault.
And you said you think this is not a historic problem, it's a present-day problem. Why do you not have faith in the church to change?
I guess I've seen too much of it, and I feel that there's still a difficulty for them to understand, A, the depth of the problem. We still get the feeling when we deal with the church that they treat these as individual anomalies, this bad priest here, this bad priest there. It's not a systemic problem. And there's really generally been no change, as far as we can see, in how they deal with it. I mean, the fact that Father Shabilsky was moved to another parish essentially a few years before the Swales trial in 2000 shows that there's no change. I mean, by 2000, they were more than aware of the problems the silent shuffle creates, but it continues.
What is your burning question for Bishop Fabro?
My burning question for Bishop Fabro is, how many more are there in this diocese? I mean, I think transparency is important here if the diocese is to gain credibility on this issue of change. And I would welcome him to open his books on the complaints he's received and have someone of some independence look into these. I mean, are there other priests in this diocese that have been moved recently because of allegations, complaints, or rumors in which there was an inadequate investigation by the diocese? There's a lot of reasons that the diocese would want to move these people. I mean, there's the avoidance of scandal. There's, the fact that this would really shatter a parish to have this allegation float forward. There's
but
a lot
surely they wouldn't want to expose more victims to this priest.
You would hope so. I mean, I really truly hope so. I hope there's change. I hope this is all just a cynical litigation lawyer who's seen too much of it from the past. But I have my concerns. I mean, it is a devastating experience for a young person. And if the church isn't doing everything that they can to avoid this repeating itself, then they need to do more. And I mean, opening their books, defrocking all these gentlemen, coming out and dealing with things in a new fashion would be very refreshing.